Hello. For days, Zimbabwe's elections have been shrouded in suspicion and rumour. But now there are hints that voters may soon have to do it all over again. Unofficial counts from the weekend's poll point to a win for the opposition leader, Morgan Tsvangirai. But he's unlikely to get the 50% required for outright victory, meaning a presidential runoff with Robert Mugabe now looms. Well, in the battle for the House of Assembly, out of the 132 results declared so far, ZANU-PF has taken 64 seats. The main opposition, Movement for Democratic Change, is just behind with 62, while a breakaway faction of the MDC currently has 6. But all eyes are now on the outcome of the presidential election. There are no official results for that yet. But an unofficial independent group called the Zimbabwe Election Support Network is predicting 49.4% for Tsvangirai, 41.8% for Mugabe and 8.2% for the former finance minister, Simba Makoni. Dorsa Jabari reports now on the long wait for Zimbabweans.
Political limbo continues for the third consecutive day in Zimbabwe, as the country's official electoral commission remains silent on the results from Saturday's presidential race. But some people in the capital Harare, which is a MDC stronghold, believe that opposition leader Morgan Tsvangirai has already won.
About the delay of the election results, was so concerned. About the election results, I believe in all towns, MDC won with a greater margin. But in rural areas, it's a 50-50 draw. I believe at the end of it all, MDC Tsvangirai won the election.
The delays in the announcements don't help suspicions and allegations made by opposition that the election has been rigged. Now, for the first time, both major parties seem to be in agreement. The MDC long claimed it was ahead in the election, and now sources within the ZANU-PF indicate that they believe Tsvangirai is ahead, but will not get the majority he needs, which will lead the country into a runoff. But amid growing concerns over the delay, the official Electoral Commission explains that it is not because of any political calculations, but rather the addition of 60 new constituencies since 2005 that have strained their counting procedures.
So it should, all things being equal, maybe take us 4 days to announce the results. But it has taken us, and it will take us probably 2 days. 48 hours. And that, by any standard, is not an inordinate delay. In fact, it is a very early result.
Against the backdrop of growing unease, police are not taking any chances. They have heightened security measures across the country to ensure violence does not ensue. So for now, Zimbabwe seems paused at a crossroads in its history, and the next 24 hours can determine which way this economically fragile country will go. Dorsa Jabari, Al Jazeera.
The British Defence Minister has confirmed that plans to pull out 1,500 troops in the next few months will not now go ahead. The British handed over control of Basra city to Iraqi security forces last September. But their troops have been pulled back into an Iraqi crackdown on militia operating in Basra and other southern towns. Speaking in Parliament, the British Defence Minister Des Brown confirmed the postponed withdrawal.
In the light of the last week's events, however, it is prudent that we pause any further reductions while the current situation is unfolding. It's absolutely right that military commanders review plans when the conditions on the ground change. I'm sure, Mr. Speaker, that honourable members would not expect us to do anything else. So at this stage, we intend to keep our forces at the current levels of around 4,000 as we work with our coalition partners and with the Iraqis to assess future requirements. And I would expect to be able to update the House on force levels later this month.
US President George Bush has arrived in Romania ahead of the biggest ever NATO summit, where he'll be urging members to commit more troops to Afghanistan. Earlier on Tuesday, Bush was in Ukraine, where he vowed to give full support for its bid to join the NATO alliance. The Kremlin has warned of a deep crisis as it worries that the former Soviet republic would become a buffer between Europe and Russia. Jonah Hull has this report.
With a welcome like this, spreading freedom and democracy around the world must seem an odd business at times to the US president. After all, American support was a factor in the success of the Orange Revolution 3 years ago that overturned a rigged election and brought democratic government to this former Soviet state. Puzzling, then, that such angry sentiment should greet Bush's open arms of support.
Ukraine is the only non-NATO nation supporting every NATO mission. In Afghanistan and Iraq, Ukrainian troops are helping to support young democracies. In Kosovo, Ukrainians are helping keep the peace.
The vast majority of Ukrainians are strongly opposed to NATO membership. Some recall NATO as their Cold War foe. Others see it simply as an aggressive military alliance that will suck their men and boys into war. Iraq and Afghanistan, of course, particularly unpopular examples here. The parties seen responsible for both NATO and George Bush. Few see the need for an organisation like NATO.
Show me a country they've protected. And who should we be protected against? Russia? It is our brother nation.
Yet Ukraine's pro-Western president Viktor Yushchenko hopes George Bush's support is enough to sway doubters within the alliance itself. It's questionable whether the outgoing US president still has that sort of clout.
It is very important to have this visit immediately prior to the summit of NATO, which is a signal of full support of the United States to this idea. And regardless of the final decision of the Bucharest summit, there is a clear signal that America supports and will support this idea in the future if it not happens now.
The biggest challenge to Ukraine's chances is Russia. Moscow warning of deep crisis if NATO expands any further towards its borders. With a new president in the wings, some powerful NATO members are reluctant to jeopardize the possibility, at least, of better future relations. It's a matter George Bush can take up for himself when he meets Vladimir Putin in Sochi on the weekend. But it's even less likely he'll have much influence there. Jonah Hull, Al Jazeera, Kiev.
In Afghanistan, a bomb has exploded inside a police headquarters in Nimroz province. Taliban sources have told Al Jazeera they were responsible for the attack and claim to have killed 20 people. Government sources say 2 policemen were killed and 5 other people wounded. 2 Palestinian fighters belonging to Hamas have been killed during an Israeli raid on the Gaza Strip. Hundreds of mourners later marched through the town of Khan Yunis for their funerals. An Israeli spokeswoman said the men were shot by troops carrying out an operation against what she called terrorist infrastructure in the territory. Police in Ivory Coast fired tear gas at demonstrators who were protesting against big increases in food prices. At least a dozen people were arrested in the capital, Abidjan, as police clashed with stone-throwing youths. The unrest in Abidjan is the latest in a series of protests over rising food prices in West Africa. Sunday saw similar disturbances in Senegal. Well, he's been in office for only a few months, but already South Korea's new leader, Lee Myung-bak, appears to have presided over a breakdown in the delicate relations with his northern neighbour. Pyongyang has launched a tirade against Lee's get-tough attitude, saying it would lead to catastrophic consequences, namely reducing his country to ashes. Paul Allen reports.
Things have not been quite the same between North and South Korea since this man took power. South Korean President Lee Myung-bak promised a harder line on the North, and he seems to be delivering. His toughest stance is on economic aid, tying it directly to North Korea's progress on dismantling its nuclear weapons program. The North has now missed the deadline for declaring and disabling its main nuclear reactor by 3 months. These policies are making President Lee public enemy #1 in North Korea. He's been called a sycophant of the United States by the North's Rodong Shinmun newspaper. It warns the Lee regime will be held fully accountable for the irrevocable, catastrophic consequences. Those consequences, as stated by North Korean television, include reducing the South to ashes. The North has test-fired missiles in the past week and accuses the South of breaching the disputed sea border. It's also expelled South Korean workers from a jointly run industrial complex just inside the North Korean border. Only 5 months ago, former South Korean President Roh Moo-hyun was being greeted warmly in North Korea. President Lee has refused such a visit himself. South Koreans will soon get a chance to endorse or reject this tough new stance. In just over a week, parliamentary elections will be